Esther has been playing the violin for 11 years, starting in first grade. Having lived in both Korea and United States before moving to India, she developed a love for traveling and experiencing different cultures. In her free time, she enjoys listening to music and spending time with her friends and family. May is interested in learning about philosophical ideas and watching quantum mechanics theories on YouTube. She has played the violin since the age of 5 and still plays when she wants to rest. She has lived in Korea, Vietnam, and India, so she has experienced multiple intersections between the cultures. But the one that has shaped her identity the most is Korea. Please welcome this duo's speakers.
Digital generation, navigating connection and self-value. Connection is something that everyone values, but the way we experience connection has changed dramatically in the digital age. When people talk about Gen Z, the one thing that always comes up is that we're the most connected generation ever. If you think about it, this isn't wrong, since there are many different apps and platforms that are used by our generations to stay connected. Technically, you can talk to as many people as you want anywhere in less than 5 minutes. Somewhere along the way, I felt that the meaning of the word connection has shifted. The real question isn't whether we're actually connected. The real question is, what does connection actually mean? For previous generations, connection was closely tied with physical presence. You met in person and talked for hours. You actually had to spend time together in person to feel this sort of bond. If you wanted to maintain a friendship, you had to invest time and effort. Today, communication looks completely different. The meaning of the word connection has shifted towards accessibility and visibility. Based on how we stay connected through social media, we feel valued, remembered, and acknowledged. Therefore, connection becomes something that's measurable by views, replies, and frequencies. And this shift completely makes sense. Social media has expanded the ways connections can look. Friendship is no longer limited in any way. We can maintain friendship across continents and even reconnect with people that we might have lost. We can even find communities that understand our identities and struggles, which was not very possible in the past. Gen Z is not emotionally disconnected, but rather we're connected in ways that were once impossible. But issues come in from the depth of our connections, as most of our interactions become short and fragmented. In the past, because interaction required time and effort, relationships often became deeper and more meaningful. Today, communication looks very different. Most of our interactions are short and quick. We're constantly in contact, but many of our exchanges are brief and surface level. We interact more frequently, but we do not necessarily share more about ourselves. As a result, we talk to more people every day, but yet we still feel that a very few people truly understand us. Another major change is that the connection has become more public. Sometimes we focus more on showing that we're connected rather than feeling connected. When relationships become content, it becomes easier for performances to replace presence. And this is where the definition of the word connection matters the most. If connection meant interaction, then the answer will be yes, Gen Z is the most connected generation in history. Most connected generation in history. But if connection meant depth, presence, and understanding, then the answer becomes much more complicated. Technology did not remove connection, it reshaped it, it sped it up, it made it constant. But depth does not always grow at the same speed as access. So maybe the tension that comes along with is not because we're not disconnected. Maybe it's because we're navigating two definitions at once. The past definition says connection is physical presence that requires meaningful interaction. The other defines it as constant communication. Now, the real task for Gen Z is not to reject social media, but to become intentional about what connection should mean for us. Instead of allowing social media to define connection and making it automatic and shallow, we can consciously try to define it ourselves to make it something that's our own and something that's deeper.
the impact of social media beyond how we interact with others in the external environment, it also affects the way of our interpretation and internal self-value. Before I started using social media, my self-esteem was very high. I genuinely liked who I was. I was comfortable with myself. But everything started to change when I began using social media. Once I started using Instagram, Snapchat, and all of these different kinds of social media, I was suddenly exposed to an endless number of people who were prettier, more successful, and more popular than me. No matter how confident I was before, there was always someone who seemed better. I started comparing my posts to theirs. I compared how many likes I've got versus how many likes they've got. I checked views, comments, reactions, and things that I've never cared about before. And without realizing it, my self-esteem was slowly dropping, not overnight, but gradually. In fact, this pattern is not something that I have only experienced. In 2023, the quasi-experimental study with 240 participants involving 120 adolescents and 120 adults received either positive, neutral, or negative feedback on their posts. Self-esteem was measured using a standardized self-esteem scale before and after the feedback. What they found was striking. Adolescents showed much larger changes in self-esteem in response to the feedback than adults, with positive feedbacks causing stronger increases and negative feedbacks resulting in sharper decline. What this study suggests is that self-esteem in teenagers is not just influenced by social media use itself, but by how much value we place on that external validation. Because the same used by adults didn't show much change in their self-esteem. When approval becomes quantifiable, when several likes or comments can boost or damage how we feel about ourselves rapidly, it becomes easier to equate those numbers with worth. So, what is the relationship between self-esteem and the use of social media for Gen Z? I personally think that social media directly, in this picture, it is obvious that social media directly declines the self-esteem. However, I personally do not agree with that statement. I personally think that the real issue is how Gen Z uses social media to measure self-worth. If we compare Gen Z to older generations, there is a key difference. In the past, people mainly judged their own achievements. When they worked hard and felt proud about what they have accomplished, that internal sense of pride helped protect their self-esteem. Their sense of worth came largely from how they personally evaluated their effort and success. Gen Z, however, often relies on external evaluation. Likes, comments, views, and shares have been public indicators of self-value. Social media turns reaction into numbers, and once feeling becomes measurable, it becomes easy to equate those numbers with personal worth. Instead of asking, am I proud of this? We began to ask, did this perform well? As a result, our self-esteem is not damaged simply because we use social media, but because we compare ourselves to standards created by algorithms. This also explains the results of quasi-experimental study. Adults were less affected because they have had more time to develop their own standards for valuing themselves, whereas teenagers are still forming those standards and are therefore more likely to rely on the ones created by social media. The solution that I can see in this point isn't to quit social media entirely. Instead, I want to say that people have to take back the role of judging ourselves. When we allow platforms to decide our worth, our confidence becomes fragile. But when we return the judgment to ourselves, self-esteem can become something stable again. We need more control over how we define our value by our own standards.
Thank you.
Thank you.